Payback Times.
The packet was certified mail. That was the first thing that stopped me. I had been sorting through 6 weeks of accumulated envelopes at Maman's kitchen table. Utility bills, church bulletins, a postcard from Celestine in Natchitoches, moving quickly, making neat piles, while my mother sat in her good chair in the next room with the evening news for company. She'd been home from the rehab center for less than 48 hours. I'd come over to handle the mail before she tried to do it herself and wore herself out. That was what love looked like at 60, I had been thinking. Not grand gestures, envelopes. Then I picked up the cream-colored one. Oversized, heavy stock, the kind of envelope designed to feel important in your hands. A logo in the upper left corner. A sunrise rendered in orange and gold rays, like something from a wellness spa. Sunrise Equity Partners, LLC. Below the logo, in smaller print, your home, your future, your choice. I almost put it in the junks pile, but the green certified mail sticker was still attached, return receipt requested, which meant someone had made my mother sign for this. I opened it. The top sheet was printed in warm, congratulatory font, the kind companies use when they want a transaction to feel like a birthday. Welcome to your new loan, Miss Odette. We're so excited to be your partner on this journey. I read the amount, $52,400. I read it again. Then I turned to the terms page. The closing date was stamped in red ink, 9 days from today. A yellow sticky note was paper-clipped to the front of the packet, handwritten in looping cursive. Miss Odette, sign and mail back by Friday. So exciting. I set down my coffee cup. For a moment, I just sat there, holding the packet, listening to my mother agree with something the news anchor had said. My hands were steady. That was the thing about 28 years of predatory lending litigation. The alarm didn't show up in your hands anymore. It compressed itself into a cold, clear point of focus behind your sternum. I turned back to page 1 and began to read the way I used to read contracts before depositions. Slowly, precisely. Nothing skimmed. The loan was in Odette Arceneaux' name. Her address, this house, the house on St. Bernard Avenue in the Tremé, where she had lived for 51 years, where I had grown up, where my father had died in the back bedroom with his hand in hers, was described in the document as collateral, the property that secured the loan. Maman's house, which she and my father had paid off in 1998, was now apparently on its way to securing a $52,000 debt. I photographed every page before I said a word to anyone. Reflex. Preserve the evidence before anything else. 16 pages shot clearly in the kitchen light, uploaded to my secure cloud folder before the packet went back on the table. Then I started cataloging. The APR wasn't on the first page, not on the second or the third. I found it on page 8 in a block of text formatted in 8-point font, sandwiched between 2 paragraphs about escrow adjustment procedures, 21.9%. I closed my eyes for just a moment. The prime rate was hovering around 8.5%. HUIPA, the Homeownership and Equity Protection Act, kicks in enhanced disclosure requirements and significant borrower protections when a loan's APR exceeds the prime rate by more than 6.5 points. That threshold put us at 15%. This loan was at 21.9. This loan triggered HUIPA by more than 6 full percentage points. Under federal law, that meant the lender was required to provide specific disclosures at least 3 business days before closing. It meant balloon payments were prohibited on loans with terms under 5 years for a primary residence. It meant restrictions on prepayment penalties. A whole architecture of consumer protection was supposed to surround this transaction like a fence. I turned to the term structure. 5 years. Balloon payment due in full at maturity. Odette was 83 years old. In 5 years, she would be 88, expected to produce $52,000 on demand or lose the house. The prepayment penalty clause was on page 11. If my mother tried to pay the loan off early, if I went to the bank tomorrow and tried to rescue her from this, she would owe a penalty of $4,100 in the first 3 years. The document called it a loan exit fee. Charming language for a financial trap. The origination fee was $3,800, rolled into the loan principal so she couldn't see it, buried in the amount financed, inflating her debt from day one. On page 14, in a section labeled Broker Compensation Disclosure, a section most borrowers never reach, there was a notation I recognized immediately, a yield spread premium, a payment from the lender to the broker specifically for placing the borrower into a higher rate product than she qualified for. Bryce Tulliver, whoever he was, would receive a commission because he had steered my mother into a worse loan than she could have gotten elsewhere. I took out my notepad and started writing numbers. Principal, $52,400. But with the origination fee rolled in, she was actually financing $56,200 from day one. At 21.9% interest over 5 years, with the balloon payment structure and the fee schedule laid out in the documents, the total cost of borrowing, interest, fees, and penalties calculated conservatively, came to just under $78,000. $78,000 to borrow $52,400. My mother's medical bills from the hip replacement, according to the Medicare explanation of benefits I just set aside, were approximately $11,000, a hard number for a woman on a fixed income, a number that a predatory lender could make sound like a crisis requiring emergency intervention. "Maman," I called, keeping my voice easy. "Come sit with me a minute." She came slowly, the new hip still cautious, her hand trailing along the door frame. She was small and fine-boned, my mother, her hair silver white now, her face still beautiful in the way of women who have spent their lives in genuine feeling rather than performance. She sat across from me and looked at the packet on the table. "Oh, that," she said. Something flickered across her face. Not quite guilt, more like the look of someone who hopes a thing might resolve itself without conversation. "Tell me about this," I said. I folded my hands on top of the packet, unhurried. She told me. There was a man at Sacred Heart through the senior outreach ministry. The one that brought young volunteers to help older congregants with errands and yard work and rides to appointments. His name was Bryce Tulliver, very polite, very well dressed. He'd driven 3 of the older women to their doctor's appointments over the summer, including Maman, who had taken him to be simply a kind young man doing good works. When she came home from the hospital, he had visited her, brought flowers, sat with her, asked about her recovery, her bills, her worries. Then he had explained, gently, that there was something called a home equity loan, and that because Maman owned her home outright, she had what he called sleeping money, resources sitting idle that could solve her problems and give her a little cushion besides. He said it was like the house working for me, instead of me working for the house. Maman said. She looked at the packet with an expression somewhere between fondness and uncertainty. He said a lot of ladies in the neighborhood were doing it. Of course he did. He brought me some papers a few weeks ago, she continued, quieter now. A preliminary agreement, he called it. Just to get the process started, I signed it. I kept my face still. Okay. Do you have a copy of that? She thought it might be in her bedroom. I walked with her to find it, a single page, dense with fine print, which I photographed without reading yet. I would read it tonight when I was home and could think without managing my expression. Back in the kitchen, my mom watched me across the table with the particular attention of someone who knows they may have made a mistake and is trying to gauge how bad. Maman, I said, I'm going to look all of this over carefully before you sign anything else. That's just good practice with any loan document. I do this for a living. Did, she said, with a gentle smile. Did, I agreed, but the knowledge didn't retire when I did. Do you trust me to look it over? Of course, I trust you. She patted my hand. You always made things make sense. I waited until she had settled back in her chair with the news before I let myself think clearly about what I was actually looking at. This was textbook. That was what struck me, sitting in my mother's kitchen under the chicory-scented air. Bryce Tulliver had done everything by the book, not the consumer protection book, the predatory lending playbook, written and refined over decades, which I had spent my career litigating against, the access point through a trusted institution, the church, the slow relationship building, the appearances of goodwill, the targeting of an elderly woman living alone, recently hospitalized, with a paid-off home and medical bills providing the anxiety that made a solution feel like relief. The artificial urgency of a closing date, the sticky note, casual and warm, treating a $52,000 transaction like a friendly favor, and the documents themselves. Truth in Lending Act violations stacked like cordwood. TILA required that the APR be disclosed clearly and conspicuously. Page 8, 8-point font, was neither. The required HOOPA disclosures, the ones that had to be delivered at least 3 business days before closing, giving a borrower time to think, were nowhere in the packet. Then there was the right of rescission. Under TILA, for any loan secured by a borrower's primary residence, the borrower has 3 business days after closing to cancel the transaction for any reason. No questions asked. This right had to be disclosed clearly in writing, with the rescission form included. I flipped through all 16 pages again. Nothing, not a word about her right to walk away. I found Bryce Tulliver's number on the cover page, a cell number, local area code with a small printed note. Call me anytime. Happy to help. I stepped onto the back porch before I dialed, so Maman wouldn't hear. The evening had gone, blue and cool, the banana trees at the back fence rustling in a small breeze off the river. Hi, this is Bryce Tulliver. Leave me a message, young voice assured, the voice of someone who had done this before and expected it to work. Hi, Bryce. This is Delphine Arceneaux-Tran. I'm Miss Odette's daughter, and I came across the Sunrise Equity Partners packet while helping her sort through her mail this evening. I kept my voice warm, interested, just a little impressed. I'd love to understand the details before the closing, if you have a few minutes to chat. I want to make sure Maman has someone in her corner looking out for her. Please call me back at your convenience. I left my number, went back inside, and poured myself a second cup of coffee I didn't particularly want. I sat at the kitchen table and made notes in my neat, compressed handwriting. The handwriting of someone who had taken notes through thousands of client interviews, depositions, and courtroom proceedings. A's PR, 21.9%. Buried, page 8, 8-point font, TILA violation, not clearly and conspicuously disclosed. HUIPA threshold triggered. A PR exceeds prime plus 6.5 points. Balloon payment on primary residence under 5 years, prohibited under HUIPA. Prepayment penalty, $4,100 in first 3 years. Potential HUIPA restriction issue. Origination fee, $3,800 rolled into principal, not clearly disclosed as APR component. Yield spread premium, noted page 14. Broker incentive to place borrower in higher rate product. Steering, right of rescission, not disclosed in packet. Required under 15 U.S.C. section 1635. HOEPA required disclosures, not present. Timing requirement, 3 business days before closing. Preliminary agreement, need to review, may constitute advance fee or binding commitment issue. I had just finished writing when my phone rang. He'd called back in under an hour, which told me something. Either he was attentive to prospects, or he had reason to move quickly on this one. Maybe both. Miss Odette's daughter. His voice was exactly as I'd imagined it. Young, practiced, friendly in the way of a man who had learned that friendliness was the most efficient professional tool. Bryce Tulliver, so great to hear from you. Your mom is just the sweetest lady. She really is, I agreed. Thank you for calling back. I know she's excited about this, and I just want to make sure I understand what she's getting into. You know how it is with parents? A small, self-deprecating laugh. He described the loan in broad strokes. Great opportunity for seniors with home equity. Simple process. Good for her financial health. He said the phrase, peace of mind, 3 times in 90 seconds. He mentioned her medical bills. He mentioned this little extra she'd have in her account. He did not mention the interest rate. He did not mention the balloon payment. He did not mention the prepayment penalty. That's so helpful, I said when he paused. Can you tell me, what's the APR on this product? A half second of silence. Not long, but I had been listening to people pause before answers for 28 years. It's a competitive rate for this type of equity product. There are processing, the APR, I said again, gently, the annual percentage rate, the total cost of credit expressed as a yearly rate. Another pause. It'll all be in the documents your mom received? Of course, I said. I'll review those carefully. Thank you so much for your time, Bryce. I'll be in touch. I hung up and opened my laptop. I typed 3 words into the search bar. Sunrise. Equity partners. I started with the CFPB's Consumer Complaint Database because that's where people go when they've been burned and they're angry enough to do something about it. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau maintains a public record, searchable by company name. The results load in a table, organized by date and complaint category. 41 complaints. I sat back and looked at that number. 41 people who had found their way to the federal complaint database, which meant there were likely hundreds who hadn't. Balloon payment issues, undisclosed fees, high-pressure tactics, elderly borrowers. Several complaints specifically mentioned a broker named B. Tulliver. 3 noted that borrowers had been connected to the lender through faith-based community programs. He had done this before. Of course, he had. The light in the kitchen had gone amber, then gray. From the living room, I could hear my mother's program ending, the familiar note of its closing theme. In a few minutes, she would come in and ask if I wanted to stay for dinner. She would offer to make rice and something from the refrigerator, and I would gently insist on making it myself because her hip needed rest. And we would talk about Celestine and the church ladies and whether the night-blooming jasmine out back had survived the heat this summer. I would act for the entire evening as though I were simply her daughter, because the last thing I needed was for Bryce Tulliver to know what he was dealing with before I was ready. I closed the laptop. I picked up my pen. At the top of a fresh page in my notepad, I wrote 2 things. The first was a list that started with CFPB complaint, formal, and continued for 7 more lines. The second was a name, Bryce Tulliver. I had only just started. I drove home from Maman's with the loan packet photographed and logged, and the windows cracked, letting the October night air move through the car. The streets of the Treme slid past in amber streetlight. The iron galleries, the old shotgun houses, the corner where Mr. Fontenot used to sit on his steps and wave at everyone who passed. He'd lost his house in 2007 to a lender not so different from Sunrise Equity Partners. I'd been 30 years into my career by then and couldn't save it. The memory sat in me like a stone. By the time I reached my own house in Mid-City, I had a list forming. I made a pot of real coffee, not the chicory blend I kept at Maman's for her taste, but the dark roast I kept for long nights, and spread my notes across the dining room table. My home office was more organized, but the dining room had better light and more space. And I had learned over decades of case preparation that space mattered when you were building something. You needed to see everything at once. The Sunrise Equity Partners loan packet was arranged in page order, my handwritten notes beside it, my laptop open to the CFPB complaint database where 41 entries waited. I pulled a fresh legal pad from the drawer and wrote at the top, with the date and time, Arceneaux, Odette M., Gitte, documentation, log. Every action I took from this point forward would be recorded with a timestamp. That was not paranoia. That was how you built a complaint that held up, how you built a lawsuit that settled, how you built a record that regulators could actually use. First, I went to the Louisiana Office of Financial Institutions public database. The OFI keeps licensure records for all entities operating as mortgage brokers or lenders in the state, and those records are public. Sunrise Equity Partners, AEL LC. I typed the name and waited, licensed, but the issue date stopped me. 14 months ago. 14 months. This company had been operating in Louisiana for barely over a year, and they already had 41 complaints in the CFPB database and a pattern of targeting elderly homeowners through faith communities. I pulled the license record and printed it, noting the registered agent name and the corporate address in Metairie. Not even New Orleans proper, not the kind of established financial services address that should be taking a paid-off Treme property as collateral. Then I pulled up the NMLS. The nationwide multi-state licensing system is the public registry for individual mortgage loan originators. Every licensed broker in the country has an NMLS number, and that number follows them. Tulliver's was printed on page 3 of the loan packet in the broker disclosure section. Most borrowers never think to look it up. I typed it in, Bryce Allen Tulliver, licensed in Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi, 29 years old, under regulatory actions, 2 prior complaints. The Texas complaint had been dismissed for insufficient evidence, which in my experience meant the borrower had been isolated, frightened, or both, and hadn't had someone like me in their corner. The Mississippi complaint was different. It had resulted in a cease and desist order from the Mississippi Department of Banking issued 18 months ago for deceptive practices in the marketing of high-cost loan products. The order had required remediation and a compliance training program. 18 months ago, Mississippi had told Bryce Tulliver to stop doing exactly what he was now doing to my mother. 14 months ago, he'd gotten himself licensed in Louisiana. I wrote all of this down in my log, noted the NMLS reference numbers, printed the regulatory action pages, and added them to the growing file. Then I sat back and looked at what I had. This was not an impulsive opportunist. This was someone who had been caught, sanctioned, and relocated. Someone who had decided that the answer to a cease and desist was a new state license. Someone who had found a new pipeline, the senior outreach ministry at Sacred Heart, and was working it methodically. My mother was not his only target. She was simply the one who happened to have a daughter who used to litigate these cases for a living. I thought about that for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and started a new list. The next morning was a Tuesday, bright and cool, the kind of October day that makes Louisiana feel like it's finally exhaled after summer. I was on the phone by 8:15. Marcus Delacroix answered on the second ring, which told me he was already at his desk. He was a staff attorney in the Louisiana Attorney General's Consumer Protection Section. We'd worked together on 3 separate predatory lending matters in the early 2010s, back when the post-crisis flood of bad actors had kept everyone in our world running. He was careful, precise, and deeply unimpressed by people who thought regulatory agencies moved too slowly to matter. Delphine, his voice had the warmth of genuine professional respect. It's been a minute. Tell me you're not calling about what I think you're calling about. Sunrise Equity Partners, I said, a pause. We've been watching them. I know, 41 complaints in the CFPB database. 43 now. 2 more came in last week. I heard him shift in his chair. We need a live victim willing to participate in a formal complaint, someone who hasn't already closed, someone where we can document the whole predatory structure before they lose anything. My mother, I said, Odette Arceneaux, 83 years old, paid off home in the Treme, hip replacement 2 months ago, introduced to Tulliver through the Sacred Heart Senior Outreach Program. Closing is scheduled for 9 days out. She has signed a preliminary agreement she didn't understand and has not been provided HOEPA disclosures. The silence on Marcus's end was the particular silence of someone assembling pieces very quickly. You need her to be a formal complainant, I said. She will be, with me as her attorney of record. You're still licensed? Inactive status, but I can reactivate for a specific matter. I've already checked. I had done this at 7:45 this morning, coffee in hand. Louisiana State Bar website open. Reactivation for a limited scope representation was straightforward. The structure of this loan triggers SHUIPA, a PR of 21.9% against a prime rate of 8.5%. That's more than 13 points above prime, well over the 6.5 threshold. Balloon payment on a primary residence, missing rescission disclosure. And he hit her with an advance rate lock fee demand of $500 after I spoke with him on the phone. He asked for money up front. He mentioned it casually, said she should send it in to lock the rate before closing. I recorded the call. Louisiana is one-party consent. Another silence, this one with a different texture. Delphine, he said, I need you to file formally through the AG's Consumer Protection Portal today. Use your attorney letterhead, flag it urgent, and reference my name in the filing. I'm going to loop in our financial investigations unit. Already planned, I said. I need you to know I'm also contacting the CFPB through the Institutional Supervision Channel, not the public complaint line. And I've got a call this morning with a HUD counselor to document that mandatory housing counseling was never offered. He almost laughed. You've been up since 5, haven't you? 4:30, I said. Renee Fonvielle had been a HUD-approved housing counselor for 16 years, operating out of a small office on Government Street that stayed busy despite being perpetually underfunded. She was tall, deliberate, with the patient manner of someone who had sat across from hundreds of panicked homeowners and helped them breathe first and then think. She and I had sent each other clients for years. I referred people who needed counseling. She referred people who needed legal representation, and we had built the kind of working relationship that doesn't require small talk. She met me at her office at 10. I brought coffee and my file. WIPA covered loan, I said, setting the relevant pages in front of her. High cost under the APR threshold, no housing counseling offered or documented. Renee studied the pages without touching them, reading the way experienced professionals read, absorbing, not performing. For high-cost loans, she said slowly, the lender is required to confirm the borrower received independent counseling from an approved counselor before closing. There's no certificate here. No certificate, no reference to counseling, no counselor recommended, I confirmed. I need you to document from your independent assessment that Mrs. Arceneaux was never referred for counseling, never offered it, and does not understand the terms of this loan. I can meet with her today if she's available. She thinks we're coming by for coffee, I said. Renee raised an eyebrow. Does she know what's in those documents? She knows enough. I sat with her last night and explained the broad strokes. I want to walk through it more carefully with her today. But I wanted you there when I did, so you can document her understanding independently. I paused. She's 83 and she's sharp, Renee. She is not incompetent. She was deceived by someone who spent 3 months building her trust before he handed her a 16-page loan document and a sticky note telling her to sign by Friday. Renee's jaw set in the way of someone containing an opinion about human behavior that was not suitable for a professional setting. I'll be there at 1. We sat around Maman's kitchen table, the same table where I'd found the loan pack the evening before, where the golden afternoon light now came through the shutters in the same familiar slats. Renee had her own notepad. I had my file. Maman had made fresh coffee because she made coffee the way she breathed, without thinking about it, because hospitality was reflexive. Maman, I said, once we were settled, I want to go through this loan with you properly, not to alarm you, but because you deserve to understand exactly what was being offered and why I'm concerned. She folded her hands on the table. 83 years old, this woman who had raised me in this house on a teacher's salary, whose husband had driven a delivery truck. who had navigated the world with more grace than most people 3 decades younger. She deserved the truth. "Tell me," she said. So I told her. Plainly, the way I'd learned to explain these things to clients who had no legal training, but every right to understand their situation. "The loan is for $52,400, I said. "But because of the origination fee, nearly $4,000, that gets rolled into what you owe from day one. So you'd actually be paying interest on $56,000, not $52,000. You'd never see that fee itemized at closing because it disappears into the loan amount. That's the first way these loans hide their real cost." Mama nodded slowly. "The interest rate is 21.9%, I said. "The average rate for a home equity loan right now is somewhere between 8 and 10%. Bryce told you it was competitive for your situation, but your situation is that you own your home outright, which makes you a low-risk borrower. You should qualify for a much better rate. He steered you toward a worse product because he earns more commission when he does." "He earns more if I pay more," she said, and there was something in her voice, not quite hurt, more like the quiet disappointment of someone whose charitable view of a person has just been corrected by fact. "That's called a yield spread premium," I said. "The lender pays the broker extra for placing borrowers in higher rate products than they qualify for. It's a direct financial incentive to overcharge. Your loan documents show that Bryce received this kind of payment." I kept going through the list. The balloon payment, 5 years, full balance due, when she would be 88 years old. The prepayment penalty that would cost $4,100 if she or I tried to pay it off early and escape. The missing notice of her right to rescind, which under federal law she was entitled to receive clearly and in writing. The right to change her mind for 3 full business days after closing, no questions asked. "He never mentioned I could change my mind," she said. "No, he didn't, and he was required by law to tell you." Renee was writing steadily, documenting Mama's responses, noting her comprehension of each term once explained, building the independent record that would show, in any regulatory proceeding or courtroom, that this borrower had been denied the information she was legally entitled to have. I took the most time on HOEPA because I wanted Maman to understand not just that something was wrong, but what the law actually said about it. "There's a federal law called the Home Ownership and Equity Protection Act," I said. "It was specifically written to protect homeowners from exactly this kind of loan. The law says that if your loan's interest rate is more than 6.5 percentage points above a benchmark rate, the average prime offer rate, which right now is around 8.5%, the loan is legally classified as high cost, and high cost loans have to follow special rules." I did the math on a notepad and turned it so she could see. 6.5 plus 8, and a half is 15%. Your loan is at 21.9%. This is a high-cost loan under federal law, and high-cost loans cannot have balloon payments on a primary residence. Cannot. It's prohibited. Mama looked at the numbers. Then she looked at me. "So what Bryce was asking me to sign was illegal." "Parts of it, yes, and the parts that aren't outright illegal are still predatory, designed to cost you far more than they appear to at first glance." I reached across and covered her hands with mine for a moment. "Over 5 years, With every fee and interest payment calculated, this loan would cost you nearly $78,000. To borrow, $52,000. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a mockingbird started up in the backyard, cycling through its repertoire against the October afternoon. My medical bills were $11,000, she said. Yes, Mama. He made it sound like such a simple thing. He is very good at making it sound simple, I said. That is how he makes his living. She straightened slightly, the way I had seen her straighten 1,000 times when she had decided something. What do we do? That, I said, is exactly the right question. What we did in the days that followed was methodical and quiet and completely invisible to Bryce Tulliver. The first thing was the credit freeze. A fraud alert requires any creditor to take extra steps to verify identity before extending new credit. It's free, it's immediate, and it goes on record with all 3 bureaus simultaneously when you contact one. I sat with Mama, and we placed the alert together so she understood what we were doing and why. It wouldn't undo the preliminary agreement she'd signed, but it would complicate any attempt to rush through additional products before I was ready to act. The limited power of attorney took 2 days to prepare properly. I wanted it limited in scope to real estate. Transactions specifically, not a broad grant of authority that could create complications later. I drafted it carefully, had it reviewed by a colleague, and we executed it properly. Notarized, witnessed, filed with the clerk of court for Orleans Parish. It was now a matter of public record that Delphine Arceneaux-Tran was authorized to act on Odette Arceneaux's behalf in any matter involving real property. If Sunrise Equity Partners wanted to proceed with this closing, they would be dealing with me in a legal capacity. The letter to the title company went out the same afternoon I filed the POA. I identified myself as attorney of record for Odette Arceneaux, provided my bar registration number, and informed them in plain language that the closing scheduled for the loan in question was subject to pending regulatory complaints, and that all communications regarding this transaction must be directed to me. I attached a courtesy copy of my reactivation paperwork. I did not threaten them. I simply informed them of the situation. The title company responded within 4 hours. Their response contained 3 sentences. They acknowledged receipt of my letter. They were reviewing the file. They had placed a hold on the scheduled closing date. Tulliver didn't know that yet. I called him the next afternoon while sitting at my dining room table with my recording running, my notes open, and my coffee cooling at my elbow. When he picked up, his voice had lost none of its warmth. He still thought he was managing a nervous daughter who needed reassurance. Delphine. He'd moved to first names without being invited. So glad you called back. How's Miss Odette doing? Feeling better, I hope? She's doing so well. Thank you for asking. I let a little breath of relief into my voice. I do have some questions about the loan. I just want to make sure I understand what she's signing. Of course. That's what I'm here for. What can I clear up? For you, Han. Han, there it was. 41 years of professional experience. And he'd called me Han inside of 30 seconds. I asked him soft questions. I let him explain the loan in his own words. All the broad strokes and no specifics. The peace of mind language and the great opportunity framing. When I asked him gently about the interest rate, he said it was very competitive for someone your mother's age with her credit situation. That sentence went into my log, her credit situation. Odette Arceneaux had a credit score of 740. I had pulled her report with her permission the previous evening. She qualified for considerably better than 21.9%. He was counting on me not knowing that. There was one other thing he mentioned, I said. Something about a rate lock fee? $500? Oh yeah, that's just a standard processing thing to hold her rate while we finalize the paperwork. Super common, nothing to worry about. She can just send a check or we can set up a quick online payment. Right, I said. I'll talk to her about it. Thank you so much, Bryce. After I hung up, I sat for a moment with the recording still running, adding a verbal note for the log. Advance fee demand, characterized as routine, no written disclosure provided, potentially actionable under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, wire fraud. If payment is solicited through wire, electronic transfer, or mail. I did not send the $500. I opened a new document on my laptop and began to write. The letter took me the better part of 2 evenings to get exactly right. Not because I was uncertain. The violations were clear enough that I could have dictated the list from memory. But because a letter like this is a precision instrument, every word carries weight. Every citation has to be defensible. Every demand has to be specific enough to be actionable and measured enough not to overreach. I used my own letterhead, Delphine Arceneaux-Tran, J.D. Louisiana Bar. Number reactivated and listed, the letter opened with a brief identification of the matter and the parties, then moved directly into the violations. I had cataloged 12, and I named each one with its statutory basis. Failure to disclose the APR clearly and conspicuously, as required by 15 U.S.C. Section 1638, the Truth in Lending Act, with the APR buried in 8-point font on page 8 of a 16-page document. Failure to provide the notice of right to rescind required under 15 U.S.C. Section 1635 for any loan secured by the borrower's primary residence. Violation of HOEPA's prohibition on balloon payment structures for high-cost loans with terms under 10 years on a primary residence, pursuant to 15 U.S.C. Section 1639. Failure to provide required HOEPA disclosures at least 3 business days before consummation. Failure to refer the borrower for independent housing counseling as required for high-cost loans. A yield spread premium arrangement that created a direct financial incentive to steer the borrower into a higher rate product in potential violation of RESPA anti-steering provisions. An undisclosed origination fee rolled into the loan principal without clear APR disclosure. A prepayment penalty structure that may violate HOEPA restrictions on high-cost loan prepayment terms. Solicitation of an advance fee, $500, described as a rate lock fee, without written disclosure, potentially constituting wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, if solicited through electronic or postal channels. I cited Louisiana's Unfair Trade Practices and Consumer Protection Law, which provides for treble damages and attorney's fees in cases of unfair or deceptive acts in trade or commerce. I cited 3 prior Mississippi regulatory actions and referenced the cease and desist order Tulliver had operated under before relocating to Louisiana. I demanded, in numbered items, immediate written confirmation that all preliminary agreements signed by Odette Arceneaux were rescinded with no financial obligation on her part, cessation of all collection or closing activity related to this loan. Production of all documents provided to or signed by Odette Arceneaux, and written confirmation that no adverse action had been or would be taken against her credit. I gave them 5 business days to respond. The carbon copy line at the bottom was its own kind of message. Louisiana Attorney General's Consumer Protection Section, attention Marcus Delacroix. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, institutional supervision. Louisiana Office of Financial Institutions. NMLS supervising entity for licensee Bryce Allen Tulliver. And the title company, whose name and contact already appeared in my file. I read it twice, corrected 1 citation, and sent it certified mail with return receipt requested, the same way the loan packet had arrived in my mother's mailbox. I also sent it by email, with read receipts enabled to every address associated with Sunrise Equity Partners I had been able to locate, including the corporate registered agent in Metairie. It was sent at 9:47 on a Wednesday morning. By Thursday, the title company had confirmed in writing that all closing activity was suspended. By Friday, I had a call from Marcus's office confirming the AG's consumer protection filing was active and that the Financial Investigations Unit had opened a review. Bryce Tulliver did not call, not yet. On Saturday morning, Mamo and I sat on her back porch in the thin October light and had coffee and beignets that she had made herself because she said she was tired of being managed. The hip was improving. The night-blooming jasmine, which I had worried about in the summer heat, had survived and was putting out a last brave scatter of white flowers along the back fence. I had not told her every detail. She didn't need the statutory citations and the NMLS regulatory history. What she needed and what I gave her was the truth in plain language. The loan was being stopped. The preliminary agreement she'd signed had no force now that I'd formally rescinded it as her attorney. Her credit file was protected. Her house was not going anywhere. She sat with her coffee and looked at the jasmine for a while. "You know," she said, "when Bryce first told me about the loan, I felt embarrassed for needing help for the medical bills." She paused. "He saw that. He used it." "Yes," I said, "that's what makes it predatory. It wasn't random. He found people who had something worth taking and a reason to feel they needed help." "And other people from the church?" I thought about the 3 complaints in the CFPB database that specifically mentioned faith-based community outreach. "Possibly," I said carefully. "That's something the people I've spoken with at the AG's office will be looking at." She was quiet for another moment. Then she set down her coffee cup with the particular deliberateness of someone who has reached a decision. "Delphine," she said, "I want you to stop him from doing this to someone else." I looked at her. This woman who had raised me in this house, who had watched neighbors lose their homes to lenders not so different from Sunrise Equity Partners, who had shaped my entire understanding of why this work mattered. "I know, Maman," I said. "That's already the plan." The call came on a Monday morning, 48 hours after my letter had been delivered and signed for. The number was Tulliver's cell. When I answered, he sounded like a different person than the one who had called me Han 3 days ago. The warmth was gone. What was underneath it was younger, less certain, doing its best to sound controlled. "Delphine, hey, I got your letter. I'm glad it arrived," I said. "Look, I think there may have been some miscommunication along the way." I want to make sure Miss Odette is taken care of. And I think I can make things right here. I let a long moment pass. I let him explain in vague terms that there was room to renegotiate, that he hadn't meant for anything to feel pressured, that his company valued its relationships with clients and their families. None of it was an admission. None of it was useful without more. I let him finish. "Thank you for reaching out, Bryce," I said. "You have 3 business days remaining under my letter's response deadline. I'd encourage you and your counsel to use that time carefully." A pause. "Is there anything else?" There wasn't. I was already on the line with Marcus's office when my phone began buzzing against the table. An unfamiliar number. I finished my sentence to Marcus, told him to expect more movement this week, and looked at the screen. The caller ID read, Garrison, Prewitt, and Mall, LLC. A quick search while the phone rang confirmed what I suspected, a Metairie corporate law firm, the kind that handled regulatory matters and institutional clients. Sunrise Equity Partners had sent their attorney. I set the phone face down and picked up my coffee. Outside, the October light was moving through the live oak in my backyard, and the neighborhood was waking up with the particular sounds of a weekday morning. A screen door, a car engine, a child's voice down the block. I let the call go to voicemail. They could leave a message like everyone else. I was deciding, with the patience of someone who had spent 41 years learning how to use time as a tool, exactly what I wanted from this meeting before I agreed to have it. And what I wanted was considerably more than just my mother's safety. The Sunrise Equity Partners office was in a low-slung commercial building off Veterans Memorial Boulevard in Metairie, sandwiched between a tax preparation franchise and an urgent care clinic. I had chosen this location for the meeting deliberately, suggested it in the voicemail. I eventually returned to Garrison, Prewitt, and Mall, LLC, with the pleasant firmness of someone offering a courtesy rather than accepting one. I wanted to see the operation. I wanted them at their own address when they agreed to my terms. I arrived 5 minutes early, which in my professional life has always meant exactly that. Not 10 minutes, not 2, 5. Enough time to orient, thus to observe, to settle into a room before the other parties arrive and read what they've arranged. The lobby was aggressively cheerful. The same Sunrise logo from the loan packet blown up large on the wall behind the reception desk, orange and gold. A young woman at the desk looked up and smiled with the practiced brightness of someone who had been told to smile regardless of context. I gave her my card, Delphine Arceneaux-Tran, JD, the reactivated bar number printed below my name. The conference room was at the end of a short hallway. I was shown in and left alone for 90 seconds. Enough time to choose my seat, which I did with intention. I sat with my back to the window so the light would be behind me and in the eyes of anyone seated across the table. I set my legal pad to my left, my file folder to my right, and placed my phone on the table with the recording app already running, screen facing up. When they came in, there were 3 of them, a young man in a suit that was slightly too new, carrying a leather portfolio, the outside attorney from Garrison, Prewitt, and Mole. He introduced himself as Daniel Hewitt and shook my hand with the careful grip of a man pretending to be more comfortable than he was. A woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the particular pallor of someone who had not slept well in several days. She introduced herself as Claire Fontenot, compliance officer for Sunrise Equity Partners, and an older man, heavy-set, who sat at the far end of the table and did not introduce himself at all. I noted him in my log later as unknown male, possibly principal. I looked at each of them in turn. Then I looked at the empty chair beside Daniel Hewitt. I expected Mr. Tulliver would be joining us, I said. Claire Fontenot answered without quite meeting my eyes. Mr. Tulliver is no longer with the company. I wrote that down slowly enough that they could see me doing it. The date, the time, the statement, the speaker's name. Then I uncapped my pen, set it parallel to the legal pad, and folded my hands. I have a recorder running, I said. I'm noting that for the record now. Louisiana is a one-party consent state, but I prefer transparency. Does anyone object? No one objected. Good. I opened my folder to the first tab. Let's begin. Daniel Hewitt opened, as junior associates often do, with the language of reasonable resolution. Sunrise wanted to address any concerns. Sunrise was committed to compliance. Sunrise valued its relationship with the Louisiana communities it served. He said the word relationship 3 times in 90 seconds, which told me his senior partner had given him talking points, but not enough preparation. I let him finish. I waited until the room was completely quiet. The particular silence that falls when everyone present understands that the person who has not yet spoken is the one with something worth hearing. Then I opened my folder to the first document. My client is Odette Arceneaux, I said, 83 years old, primary residence, paid off property in the Treme, in her name since 1972. She was recruited into a loan product through a relationship of false trust built over 3 months through Sacred Heart's Senior Outreach Ministry. The loan carried an APR of 21.9%, triggered HOI-CHWIPA, high-cost loan protections, contained a prohibited balloon payment structure, failed to disclose the right of rescission, failed to provide a mandatory housing counseling referral, and included an advance fee solicitation that may meet the statutory threshold for wire fraud. I paused. None of that is in dispute. I have the documents, the recordings, and a CFPB complaint with an active case number. I turned to the second page. The AG's office contact, Marcus Delacroix's name on the letterhead of the formal referral I had filed. The Louisiana Attorney General's Consumer Protection Section has an open review. I continued. The Louisiana Office of Financial Institutions has been notified regarding licensing concerns. NMLS has received a formal complaint against Mr. Tulliver's individual license. I set each page on the table as I named it, precisely, the way I used to lay out evidence in depositions, not for drama, but for clarity. Now, here's what I am asking for. I presented the terms the way I had written them in my dining room 2 nights earlier, revised once for precision and not again. 4 items. First, immediate written cancellation of every document Odette had signed, delivered to her directly with a plain language explanation of each item being voided, not through me, to her, in her home, in language she could read and understand without a law degree. Second, a payment of $3,500 to Odette as compensation for the impact of the preliminary agreement on her credit file and the distress caused by the transaction process. Third, a written commitment from Sunrise to implement HOEPA compliant disclosure practices across their entire Louisiana loan portfolio, subject to monitoring through the AG's office for a minimum of 18 months. Fourth, in exchange for cooperation, I would characterize the CFPB complaint as resolved with company cooperation, rather than escalating it to a formal enforcement referral, which, given the relationships I had developed during my career, I had standing to pursue. Daniel Hewitt cleared his throat. He said that Sunrise was fully prepared to address the first and third items and recognized the importance of resolving this promptly, but that the $3,500 figure was... I opened the folder to the second tab. I have analyzed the 43 complaints currently filed against Sunrise Equity Partners in the CFPB public database, I said, and cross-referenced them with Louisiana Office of Financial Institutions records and public property data for Orleans Parish. I set the summary sheet on the table turned so they could read it. In the past 14 months, at least 6 other elderly borrowers in this parish received loan products from Sunrise through what I now understand was a structured referral pipeline through area churches. Mr. Tulliver flagged borrowers with paid-off primary residences and no co-borrowers. I looked at the summary sheet for a moment, then up. My question for this room is whether you would prefer I assist those 6 borrowers in filing individual complaints before or after we reach an agreement today. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room in which a calculation has just been made very rapidly by multiple people. The $3,500 is acceptable, Daniel Hewitt said. I nodded and turned to the third tab. It was Claire Fontenot, who said the thing I had suspected but not confirmed. We had moved past the formal terms. Hewitt was drafting the framework of the agreement on his laptop, and the unknown man at the end of the table had said nothing through the entire meeting. Claire had been quiet too, answering only when addressed, writing in her own notepad, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone professionally required to be in this room and personally wishing they were not. She asked quietly if she could add something off the record. I looked at my phone. I turned the recording app off and set the phone face down. Go ahead. What she told me, in the measured language of a compliance professional who had spent the last 2 weeks knowing more than she could say, was this. Tulliver had been operating his own referral system independent of the company's official marketing channels. He had identified 3 area churches with active senior outreach programs and built relationships with volunteer coordinators at each one. He had flagged specific prospects in a personal spreadsheet. Homes with no mortgage recorded at the parish clerk's office, solo elderly occupants, borrowers, without co-applicants listed in credit bureau records. He had been meticulous. He had been, she said carefully, specifically seeking borrowers who had no one in their lives positioned to scrutinize the transaction. He had flagged Odette Arceneaux. Her home was paid off, the property records were clear, and her credit application showed no family members as co-borrowers or emergency contacts. He had been wrong about that last part, Claire said, and something in her voice, careful as it was, carried what might have been the ghost of a dry appreciation for the specific nature of his error. I did not allow myself any visible satisfaction. I wrote a single line in my notepad, capped the pen, and thanked her. I did not use the information to embarrass anyone in the room. The compliance officer had a conscience. That was worth more, long-term, than her humiliation. I turned the recorder back on, and we finalized the agreement. The drive back to New Orleans took 40 minutes. I spent the first 20 in the particular quiet that follows concentrated work. Not tiredness, but something more like release. Then I called Marcus Delacroix and told him what I had, including Claire Fontenot's off-record disclosure. I described it as information he might find useful in determining the scope of his office's investigation. I was scrupulous about how I characterized it, off-record, not sworn, but specific. Marcus thanked me and said the Financial Investigations Unit was very interested in the church referral pipeline. He said there was broader pattern evidence across 3 other southern states, pointing toward a coordinated operation. It's bigger than Tulliver, I said. Considerably, he said. I told him I would send the full documentation file by end of day and asked him to keep me informed on the 6 other parish borrowers. If any of them needed help navigating the resolution process, I wanted to know. Then I drove to my mother's house. The afternoon light was doing its same thing through the shutters, those familiar golden slats across the yellow tablecloth, when I sat down across from Odette Arceneaux with the signed cancellation agreement in my hands. The house smelled like coffee and old cypress and something with onions she had put on the stove before I arrived. She had set 2 cups out already. I told her everything, not a softened version, not the summary I might have, given a client I was managing. She was my mother, and she had asked me to tell her the truth, and she had earned it. I told her about Tulliver's spreadsheet, the way he had identified her specifically. I told her about the church pipeline and the other women he had approached. I told her about the Mississippi cease and desist, the new Louisiana license, the 43 complaints. I told her about Claire Fontenot and what she'd said, and about Marcus and the AG's investigation. I set the cancellation agreement on the table. Every document she had signed declared void. Sunrise's signature and date below each one. I told her about the $3,500, which would be delivered by certified check within 10 business days. She listened to all of it without interrupting, her hands around her coffee cup, her face composed. She was 83 years old, and she had navigated this world for all of them, and she was not a woman who required information to be softened before it reached her. When I finished, she looked at the cancellation agreement for a long moment. He chose me because I was alone, she said. It was not a question. He thought you were, I said. He was wrong. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Baby, you have always been the one." I reached across the table and she took my hand, and we stayed like that for a moment in the slanted light, in the kitchen where I had grown up, in the house that was still hers and would stay that way. Then she stood and went to the stove to stir whatever was in the pot and told me I was staying for dinner, and I said, I knew. 3 months later, the Louisiana Attorney General's office announced a consent order against Sunrise Equity Partners, LLC. The order required $220,000 in restitution, distributed among 14 affected borrowers across the state. Borrowers identified through Tulliver's church pipeline and through similar referral channels operated by 2 other loan officers under the same parent company structure. The consent order also mandated comprehensive SHUPA compliance training for all loan officers, third-party compliance monitoring for 24 months, and the elimination of yield spread premium compensation structures that incentivize steering. Bryce Allen Tulliver's NMLS license was suspended pending a disciplinary hearing. The NMLS Consumer Access Portal, which is public and searchable by anyone, reflected the suspension within 48 hours. One of the 14 borrowers named in the restitution order was a woman named Gertrude Melançon, 79 years old, who had attended Sacred Heart for 40 years. She had signed a loan agreement 4 months before my mother received her packet. She had been 2 weeks from closing. She had not known until a letter from the AG's office reached her mailbox that she had any options at all. I thought about Mr. Fontenot on his steps in the Treme, the house he lost in 2007. I thought about how different the outcome might have been if someone had known what to look for and where to go. The thought didn't sit in me like a stone anymore. It sat more like a direction. The folding chairs in the government street branch of the East Baton Rouge Parish Library were the same ones they'd had for as long as I'd been teaching there. Gray metal, slightly uncomfortable, arranged in 3 short rows in the community meeting room that smelled like carpet and paper and the particular institutional warmth of a public building that has always been free and open and meant for everyone. 12 people had come on a Thursday evening in January. A man I recognized from a previous workshop, retired from the Postal Service, who had started bringing a friend each time. A young couple in their late 20s, first-time homebuyers, the woman with a notebook already open, 2 women who looked to be in their 70s, who had come together and taken the seats nearest the front. A woman about my age who introduced herself quietly before we started and said she'd seen the flyer at her church. In the very front row, with her reading glasses on and a fresh notepad balanced on her knee, sat Odette Arceneaux. She had decided, sometime in the weeks after the settlement, that she wanted to understand everything. Not just what had nearly happened to her, but the whole architecture of it, the laws, the rights, the mechanisms that existed to protect people and that most people never knew about until it was too late. She had called me on a Sunday morning and said she wanted to come to the workshop. I had said I would save her a seat. I stood at the front of the room with a sample loan document in my hands. 16 pages, the kind that arrives in a cream-colored envelope with a cheerful logo and language about your home, your future, your choice. I had removed all identifying information, but I recognized every page. "This document looks official," I said. "It's designed to. The formatting is reassuring. The language sounds like a gift, but the fine print is where they hide the whole story." I held it up. "I'm going to show you how to read it." I told them about the CFPB complaint portal, consumerfinance.gov/complaint. I told them that filing a complaint against a mortgage lender or broker was free, that it created a numbered public record, and that lenders were required to respond. I told them about the NMLS Consumer Access Portal, nmlsconsumeraccess.org, that every licensed loan officer in the country had a public file that you could search by name or license number before you signed anything, and that disciplinary actions showed up there and were searchable by anyone with an internet connection. I told them about state attorneys general, that the Consumer Protection Division of the AG's office was often the most responsive resource for individual cases, faster to act than federal agencies, and with significant investigative authority. I told them about HUD-approved housing counselors, available free by calling 800-569-4287. That for any high-cost loan, a lender was legally required to offer a referral to a counselor, and that if they didn't, that omission was itself a violation. And I told them about the right of rescission. The 3 business days after closing, when you can cancel any loan secured by your primary residence for any reason, no penalty, no explanation required. A federally protected right under the Truth in Lending Act, a right that predatory lenders almost never mention because the last thing they want is a borrower who knows she can walk away. That right belongs to you, I said. It has always belonged to you. What changes today is that now you know it exists. The young woman in the front couple was writing steadily. The retired postal worker was nodding. The woman who had come from her church was looking at the sample document with an expression I recognized, someone connecting a pattern to something she had experienced or witnessed or narrowly escaped. And in the front row, Odette Arceneaux sat with her reading glasses on and her fresh notepad on her knee, writing things down in her careful teacher's cursive because she had decided she was going to know everything now. I caught her eye for just a moment. She gave me a small, precise nod, the nod of a woman who has been paying attention her whole life and intends to keep doing so. I looked back at the room at the 12 people who had given up a Thursday evening to sit in folding chairs under fluorescent lights because they wanted to understand how to protect what was theirs. Let's start on page 8, I said. That's where they put the number they don't want you to find.